military political aspects of the space policy in Russia, in the United States, and around the world. So after that, you will have a chance to ask him questions. I urge you to turn off your microphones. If you have some questions, immediate questions, or you want to clarify some things, please use the Zoom chat. I will collect all the questions, and then we will have a session of questions and answers. Dmitry, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Pasha, and many thanks to the Moscow State University for having such an opportunity. Well, Pavel said some nice words about me, so I wouldn't waste more time to explain who I am and why you should care what I think about this stuff. So the topic of my presentation is called Space as a Warfighting Domain, Drivers, Hurdles, and Risk Reduction. And I will try to say a few words about how I personally understand like the military sphere of the outer space. Well, as one famous TV character said, space is hard. So things are quite complicated if we address space and especially the military area. But we should always remember that space was militarized forever. It's not like this is some kind of a new dynamics, something unexpected or connected to some recent activities by these or that countries. We all know that even the original Sputnik, original first satellite, was basically a part of development of an intercontinental ballistic missile. If we speak about explicitly space issues, then almost everything is dual use. Launchers, which of course currently space launch vehicles are very much different from the offensive ballistic missiles, but still some technologies are similar. Navigation, communication satellites, and of course remote sensing satellites. All these capabilities can be used for civilian purposes and for military purposes as well. And basically, our American partners were very explicit in claiming that space capabilities are necessary both for the American way of life and American way of war. So with everything being dual use effectively, it quite explains why military was always very much interested in looking into space, both as an enabler of your own military capabilities and also as a way to, degrade the capabilities of your adversary. This is normal situation to some extent. Still, especially now, what is different these days, that so many civilian assets, civilian capabilities that basically everyone uses in day-to-day life, all these things are connected to space. And that's why people are more and more interested in how the military struggle in space is ongoing, because eventually it can affect everyone, not to mention the global economy. So what are the current drivers for space being considered not only a military domain, but even a warfighting domain or operational domain, as people in NATO say? Actually, I suggest that you take a look at the NATO recently published NATO military space concept. It is a short document, but it has a wonderful kind of glossary in the end. If you're interested, I can put the link in the chat box during the Q&A session. So there are basically two drivers in space becoming more and more weaponized. One is threats to space assets, and another is threats from space assets. And threats to space assets can be put into several baskets. One way to separate them is to distinguish between threats from Earth's surface to space assets. Another way to look at another type is threats from space assets towards other space assets. Again, it's not something new. Such capabilities were under development throughout all the space era with actual live tests. And while people now have been talking a lot about recent destruction of all the Soviet satellite by a Russian missile, which could be either anti-satellite or anti-ballistic missile. It doesn't really matter much, and I'll say a few words about it later. There have been destructive tests of anti-satellite capabilities again for decades. They were not, it's not something that happens often, but it does happen. And again, given the number of space assets of spacecraft deployed not only by countries, by national space agencies, but also by commercial actors, each new space debris is a greater threat to the whole architecture. So another way to look at it is at threats to space objects by the type of threat, because while what is the most commonly known and probably the most frightening one for general public is the threats that include the destruction of space assets, those space assets can also be, for example, jammed by electronic warfare capabilities, or the links between space objects and their command centers can be undermined by cyber weapons. So there are many things that you can do to attack a space object. However, it is also should be clear that the capability or even the availability of systems that can attack space assets depends on where those space assets are, because it is very different missions to attack something that is on low Earth orbit or on geostationary orbit or geosynchronous orbit. It is quite different types of things that you need to develop to achieve such a strike capability. Also, space objects can be targeted by directed energy weapons like lasers, and while currently it seems still very much improbable that there can be some destructive option, because well, you need too much power either on the ground or in space to be actually capable to have a destructive laser beam. It is quite possible to dazzle the optical capabilities of, for example, remote sensing satellites, or simply temporarily blind those. All these questions, all these types of attacks affect the way people talk about these capabilities, including in the legal meaning of the discussion, because one thing that's if something is destroyed, another thing is if something is temporarily disabled, and even third thing is when something was temporarily disabled but it led to serious consequences on the ground. For example, we know that sometimes and recently it becoming more often than not, due to so-called GPS spoofing, the navigation equipment on the ships that travel through the Earth's seas and oceans, this navigation equipment becomes basically unusable temporarily, but sometimes it is enough for a serious collision. Of course, it can be avoided if people are more careful with what they do, and if the navigators, I mean navigators as captains and their aides, well, know their trade perfectly, then they're not so dependent on GPS assets. But on the other hand, we see more and more autonomously driven vehicles that depend on assets, including on space assets. And we also even have autonomous ships that might enter service rather sooner than later. So it is a serious issue. Then another type of threats from space. And this is basically where probably Russia is much more concerned than many other countries. The threat here, at least the way it is perceived, is that due to the rapid proliferation of remote sensing capabilities, both optical and radar, that currently are being deployed using even so-called the mega constellations of mini and micro sats. So these trends might lead to a full transparency, and transparency here is a bad word, unlike other areas of, for example, Russian territory. And this full transparency, which will become a 24-hour day, 7 days a week monitoring of all Russian, including strategic assets, might undermine the strategic stability that is based on a capability to deliver assured second nuclear strike under any circumstances. While it is still far away, such a scenario is far away because it would require much higher level of integration of data obtained by different satellites, and these satellites should be quite capable. It is still a possibility, and what makes things more complicated is the so-called machine learning and image recognition software that is being also rapidly developed. So this leads to some serious worst-case scenario planning in the Russian military, and this is one of the reasons possibly that why we both have the so-called Peresvet battle laser, which is basically a dazzler, and it is co-deployed with the road mobile ICBM launchers, which was openly declared by the senior Russian military officials. So possibly it looks like, and also according to a volume of scientific publications, the mission of the Peresvet beta laser is basically to conceal the road mobile ICBM launchers at wartime from the satellite observation. Also possibly from other sorts of unmanned aerial vehicles, but it remains to be seen if they're really capable of addressing this threat. While for the satellites, not destroy, of course, once again, not destruction of satellites, but temporary dazzling of satellites, temporary blinding the satellites. So, but at the same time, if we speak about strategic domain, the strategic weapons, both Russia and US undertook obligations not to interfere with the so-called national technical means used to observe strategic assets. So at peacetime, these capabilities can be hardly employed. And I believe it is a good thing. On the other hand, we also see the efforts to develop actual anti-satellite capabilities in Russia, in China, and elsewhere. And the reason for those is, again, the perceived threat from space assets. Space is, as I've already said, one of the main enablers of the so-called American way of war. And naturally, people who are afraid of becoming or finding themselves on the receiving end of the American warfighting machine look for opportunities to undermine this enabler. And I believe the way I explained it shows that basically threats from space and threats to space are very much interconnected, and they drive one another. Is it possible to disentangle those? Still remains to be seen. But before I move towards the hurdles and the risk reduction assets, I would also mention another very important space capability that is crucial for, well, basically for the survival of our planet, is the space-based early warning capabilities. So basically the satellites that are capable of detecting missile launches. While, of course, there is a school of thought that says that it is not that important, and sometimes early warning capabilities might produce so-called false positives and put pressure on decision makers to respond to the non-existing attack. I believe that still current as early warning systems, both in Russia and in the US, and possibly in future in China, the early warning system consists of both space and ground-based layers, and a lot of pieces of the puzzle should fall together to actually make believable that actual full-scale nuclear attack, incoming nuclear attack, is a thing. So if we have a reliable early warning system, then possibly we can, and by we can insert any major nuclear nation. If we have reliable early warning system, then possibly we are more confident that we will have enough time for nuclear retaliation, and thus we probably will not try to strike preemptively in case of crisis. But there is two challenges with that. One, the early warning systems can be used for other missions. For example, in Russian case, the current generation of the early warning satellites, so-called Tundra, which are parts of the Kupol system or EKS joint space system. They are called joint for a reason, and there is the belief that probably they have not only early warning missions, but also some sort of military communication missions or things like that, which can be not explicitly linked to like the strategic nuclear domain. And thus, in case of a conflict, the adversary might believe that though striking those targets at before nuclear threshold is crossed is possible. On the other hand, American early warning satellites of the Spears family, and probably the next generation satellites that are currently being developed for the so-called hypersonic weapons tracking, they're quite capable, at least that's what have been written in some media, sorry for that, on detecting not only the like launches of major ballistic missiles of intercontinental range, but also of tactical missiles or even massive takeoff of the even fighter jets. So again, here we see a sub-strategic mission, and thus some actors might believe that striking these capabilities at sub-strategic level, at sub-nuclear level, might be a good idea. And this is actually moves us to the next part of my presentation, of my report, that the biggest hurdle today is the lack of trust. Basically, I believe no country believes in the doctrinal statements of one another about their space capabilities. Russia considers that anything that US says about space domain as a justification of a thesis that our American partners are basically planning to deploy weapons to space, the strike weapons. Americans consider any development of any Russian long-range air missile defense weapon as a possible threat to their space assets, not to mention, and actually I should have been said about it earlier, not to mention the so-called inspector satellites, which are always always explained to be as something very useful for civilian purposes. For example, you can inspect the state of your malfunctioning satellite, or even recharge its batteries, or refuel it, or fix something by using the so-called rendezvous and proximity operations, RPO, and it is a very important acronym. I suggest you remember it. But then anyone says that, okay, if you can put your satellite near another satellite, then it can be used as a weapon, because you can put it near our satellite and damage it and so on. And this is basically what's have been going on the orbit for quite a while, with Russian inspectors chasing American satellites, American inspectors looking at Russian satellites, Chinese inspectors also doing lots of different stuff. It's quite interesting, and luckily we haven't have any serious problems with that, but it does not contribute to growing trust. In 2020, during the previous American administration, when there was some sort of strategic dialogue between Russia and the US established late into this, which was probably too late for it to lead to any fruitful results, which actually was the case. But there was a very serious meeting between the Russian and American space people, to put it this way, both from military and from diplomacy. And they spent something like 12 hours in Vienna discussing all this stuff. Of course, details were never made public, but from what we know, that the discussion was, well, to put it in a simple terms, was very detailed. So basically, they have dived deep into actual cases of the behavior by this or that spacecraft, which raised concerns. So far, we haven't seen any actual results, but it seems that there is a growing understanding of, well, of plans and of concerns of our countries. Moreover, and I think you might have heard about it, there is this fancy unmanned space plane or rocket plane, X-37B, developed by Americans, which flies in orbit for quite a while. And recently, in the Russian press, there was something that basically looks like an intended leak, explaining one of the missions that it undertook recently, which was basically deploying a small spacecraft, which then traveled relatively fast towards, like, in some sort of direction, and then afterwards it was basically taken back aboard of the X-37B. And while, of course, stories that are often told by some people in the Russian military industry that basically X-37B can be a nuclear weapon carrier, I don't think that these stories are very much real. But this case probably shows that X-37B can be used as some sort of the co-orbital strike system. On the other hand, American military officials publicly said that once they've seen how Russian Inspector satellite deployed a smaller spacecraft, which then deployed an even smaller spacecraft that traveled toward again in some direction with increasing speed, and then they basically were gathered once again. But the American military officials say that they consider this stuff to be a sort of a space torpedo. Well, it remains to be seen how realistic the things, but if we speak about these examples and lack of trust, I think you might have heard this story that surfaced last autumn about some fancy Chinese hypersonic slash fragmental orbital weapon system, which basically traveled around Earth and then deployed something else on it while it was descending, and then struck some sort of target. Fun part is that basically the Chinese said that they were testing a reusable spacecraft which resembles X-37B. So these concerns by the American partners shows a big level of so-called mirror imaging. So whatever when we see something being developed by our well, adversary or partner, it doesn't really matter how you call them, you start immediately thinking what would be the purpose of this capability if you have pursued it yourself. And this is a huge challenge. Hopefully the discussions will continue and we will reach some sort of agreement. What is also important to understand that if we speak about actual measures, there are two schools of thought. One is basically followed mostly by Americans and British, another by Russians and the Chinese. The difference is that while Russia and China had publicly proposed and then updated these proposals, a legally binding treaty that will prohibit placement of weapons to space, but we also must remember that the provisions of the treaty include the prohibition of threatening space objects by any means. The Americans, and now especially the British, they argue that before going or instead of going to legally binding regimes, which is hard to achieve, we need to start with something called norms of behavior. What sorts of such norms can be developed remains to be seen, because obviously, as I've explained earlier, especially the Western nations are much more concerned about the actual threats to their space assets. So they want to ask to develop norms that will prohibit, for example, destructive asset tests or even asset development as a whole, and also some actions on orbit that they consider threatening. The Russian and especially Chinese were very vocal in opposition of this idea by saying that basically if we speak about norms instead of bans, then basically we pave a way towards actual weaponization of space. So it will not prohibit anyone from developing anything and deploying even it, as long as they follow some sort of norms, and the way those norms can be written can leave quite a number of loopholes. If we speak about how to make these positions, and I've personally seen cases when something like, making this position something like closing the gap was obvious at some conferences. It looks like over last several months, or probably half a year or a year, on the one hand, especially the Brits became quite clear that they are not against a legally binding regime as is. Their main concern is that, we need to start somewhere. A legally binding regime is quite hard to achieve in the first place. On the one hand. On the other hand, on the Russian side, we also, our officials also started to say that, we can discuss norms as long as you are ready. By you, I mean, like the Western countries are ready to address Russian concerns as well. So it should be a two-way street, and mutual concerns should be addressed. Also, as I have explained earlier, our Western partners are much more concerned with the A-side capabilities, and they often argue that Russia and China are hypocritical when saying that they want to prevent the weaponization of outer space, but at the same time develop A-side capabilities. Recently, Chinese officials started to say that no, the PPWT, the draft treaty that prohibits placement of weapons in space, addresses also ground-based A-side capabilities. Because in the end, if there are no weapons in space, then you do not need assets to hold them at risk. It is, these discussions are very tough, to put it that way. People are, and even officials sometimes are very harsh to each other. Personally, I think that there is nothing hypocritical in developing the actual military capabilities, both with developing the political and diplomatic or legal ways to prevent these or that capabilities, because if our partners do not want to address our concerns in a diplomatic manner, then they will have to. Then we need to develop a capability to address those concerns the hard way, to simply prevent the threats we're concerned with from happening. And actually, as we can see, it looks like this because this sort of dual track approach becomes very common in many domains where Russia finds itself at a crisis or even conflict with other countries. Now it looks like Russia becomes more explicit about the actual counter-space capabilities. Airspace forces officials speak about the capability of this or that system to strike targets in space. We have the test that I mentioned earlier. I believe it can eventually lead to some, if not breakthrough, but still some positive outcome, because it is quite hard to defend your position when everyone knows that you have this capability, but you not acknowledge it. Before we lead to by we, I mean the international community, before we can see the actual results, actual agreements, probably some unilateral commitments can be made. And one of ways to do it is just to commit to prevent non-destructive asset tests, or put like your own moratorium on deploying these assets. I think it is quite possible. Another way to look at it is, as I said earlier, transparency can be used as a bad word, but it can also be used as a good word. And if countries are more, again, explicit about what they're doing in space, it can help, because sometimes, even if you are developing some military capability, its deterrent effect is increased if your adversary actually know what it can and what it cannot do, what its mission and what is not its mission, to put it this way. If we are, it will be still doing even destructive tests or some threatening operations in space, one way to address it is possibly to develop something similar to the notification regimes that we have on our surface. We have notifications to airmen, notifications to mariners, which basically tells them which sections of air and sea to avoid because some sort of missile testing is going. I think we can also talk about notifications to, well, if not to spacemen, but to spacefaring nations, by explaining in which sectors or in which orbits something will be going on. So you should make precautions. And actually, this regime can be very useful for civilian purposes as well, because as their orbits are becoming more and more congested, we see more and more satellites, and those satellites are sometimes operated by commercial actors. We lack the communication between the operators of spacecraft, of satellites. So some sort of universal notification regime can be quite useful at peacetime and any time. Another thing where we can look into some useful developments is the increased space situation awareness capabilities. Until recently, the only countries which more or less full capability to monitor what's going on in space were Russia and the US. And the US had and have much greater capability because they have their assets deployed globally, while Russia is more or less, well, of course not cornered, but have to depend on national territory, which is rather large, as we know, but still might be not enough for a full-scale space situational awareness. But recently, even some commercial actors start to develop the radars that can monitor things in space and basically have commercial space situation awareness. This means, and also we have quite a number of even mature astronomers who are becoming very capable in, if not monitoring all space situation, but in detecting this or that spacecraft of interest. For example, now we have pictures of X-37B that I mentioned, and even of a keyhole reconnaissance satellite made by amateur astronomers who basically know where to look for them and then find those at night sky, which is quite an achievement. So what I'm trying to say is that we have the transparency of space is increasing, and we can look into some international regimes that can provide more or less objective information about what's going on in space. Thus, we will have less of these cases when, for example, Chinese and American officials present the conflicting pictures of what is going on in space. Of course, it is not a perfect solution, and still there will be different explanations for this or that stuff going on in orbit, but it might be a good step forward. Eventually, we might even consider development of the so-called or redevelopment joint data exchange center between Russia and the US, or even Russia, China, and the US, where we will share data from our space situation awareness assets to make, again, to reduce the likelihood of incidents of inadvertent escalation and things like that. I think with that I'll stop. There are a lot of other topics within the theme we're discussing, but I would really like to have some feedback and answer your questions. I hope there are many of those. My last point would be that you might have seen claims that the space is the ultimate high ground and the one who controls space will control the Earth. It is definitely not the case today, tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, simply because space is not like some major ocean or whatever. It's the way it, I believe, the way it should be addressed as a domain and in theory of international relations is more like coastal waters, because well, you cannot use space for without looking at what's going on Earth. And so the conflict in space is a part of the conflict on our surface, and it would not change probably anytime soon or ever. And that I'll stop, and looking forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Dmitry, thank you very much. That was a brilliant overview, just as usual. I see that we have 4 questions in the chat. I think we will let the people who wrote those questions ask them personally. So Nikita Beluchin, your questions about European space program, and can you ask your question? I think Dmitry has covered part of the questions after you have written it, but are you here, Nikita?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
So basically, my question is about the transatlantic cooperation in space. Are there significant misunderstandings between the American partners and the European partners concerning space? And what do you think in general about the role of space policy in the European Union's so-called strategic autonomy? And another part of my question is about the exchange of satellite data. As far as I understand, the European Union's satellite fleet and the satellite fleet of states, of members of the European Union is very limited. And the European partners in general are very dependent on the satellite data provided by the United States of America. But at the same time, the exchange of satellite data is a very sensitive matter in transatlantic cooperation, and it is based on bilateral treaties between the US and some European countries. So there is no centralized system of exchange of satellite data between transatlantic partners. So basically, my question is, are there significant controversies, misunderstandings, discrepancies related to the transatlantic cooperation in the space domain?
Nikita, that's a great question. And I'd say that, well, there are several ways to look at it. Most importantly, as far as I understand, Europeans and Americans, on the one hand, consider each other sort of, competitors in terms of civilian spaces capabilities. But if it goes to the military space capabilities, then you're absolutely right. European nations are very much dependent on what can be or cannot be provided by the Americans. At the same time, there is increasing fleet of satellites developed in Europe. For example, Germans have possibly one of the biggest fleets of the radar imaging satellites, which might be not a super capability in its own, but it can augment the capabilities of other partners. And you're also absolutely right saying that this exchange of satellite data is done on bilateral basis. And these regimes appear not only, for example, between Americans and their allies, but also like there are some horizontal ways. For example, Germany and Japan recently, and Germany and Australia have similar records, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that this is the case. And this is where, again, those capabilities are very sensitive. And this is one of the reasons why this, well, boogeyman of 24-hour monitoring of Russian surface or Earth surface is probably quite hard to achieve, because in the end, even the standards of the satellite data are different. But as it is a developing process, it's not like we will live in the current situation forever. And as it is a developing process, there are growing discussions on the need for the development of the actual unified standards of satellite data, so then this data can be like fuel some sort of a pipeline, to make this analogy, where it will be used to produce a coherent picture of what's going on our surface. So the short answer is yes, Europeans are dependent. The long answer is that situation is different, and in future possibly it will be the dependency. There will be not a dependency but interdependency. But, and again, not only with between European countries and the US, but also between other American allies as well.
Thank you for your answer. But can I ask one more question to probably to get a more precise response? Can such components of the European Union space program as Copernicus and Galileo have a military use, or are these components only used for scientific purposes?
I'm pretty sure that Galileo definitely will have military use, because, well, again, you've mentioned the European strategic autonomy, and it is something that at least some European countries are very fond of and looking forward to achieving. But it will be a part of competition to some extent. But let me give a longer answer to that. The competition itself is not something that is inherently bad. The problem is that not to make a competition an actual conflict. And if we have a mix of competition and cooperation, it is possibly the most well, positive way of actually increasing the spacefaring capabilities of us as as humankind, as a planetary species. So this mix of competition and cooperation that exists between Americans and Europeans is might be a good example of overall like win-win situation. So they compete in some domains, they cooperate in other domains, and they move forward. Basically, one of the biggest examples in that is the deployment of this new telescope by the American telescope, which was deployed by European launcher. And the quality of the deployment was so good that it will actually increase the lifespan of the telescope. So this is an example that there is competition, but there is cooperation, but competition is not a problem. It might even contribute to the better results, because obviously Americans also have quite a number of launch vehicles. They have some problems with them, and I think that in other lectures you will learn more about the actual American programs and their issues. But well, if there will no cooperation with the between the US and European Union in this case, probably the result could have been worse. But as there is competition and cooperation, then the end result is better. Hopefully, this will be this will be true for the competition between other countries as well.
Thank you, Nikita. I see that you published another question, very short one, but let's give other people to ask questions. Artem Andreevich Astvatsaturov. And I believe your question is similar to a question posed by Yuan Zhuiji about a new space treaty between China, Russia, United States, and European Union. Dmitry, can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Yeah, some sort of new space treaty. I think that we should start at least with acknowledging that, our concerns are not groundless, that we acknowledge the concerns of our partners. So it's not like, because currently it looks like the main narrative, both in Washington and in Moscow and in Beijing, that everything that we do is defensive and good, and stabilizing. Everything they do is destabilizing, bad, and they do it because they're inherently like our adversary and like the things like that. It's not a good or it's like even not like good and bad, probably not the best words to use here. But with such narratives, it is impossible to move anywhere. So probably the best way is to acknowledge each other's concerns and explain the reasons for these other developments. And then after that, I'm pretty sure we can move towards some sort of a treaty. Actually, what is interesting is that Russia probably decided not to wait for such a major treaty. And as Russia is concerned with possible placement of weapons in space, we started to sign joint statements with different countries on non-placement of weapons, not being the first to place weapons in space. And while some of these countries are quite under development and definitely have no spacefaring capability, it actually means a lot, because eventually any initiatives on space security to become like a real deal, they will have to move to the United Nations, so to General Assembly and to other relevant bodies. And when they move there, Russia will also already be quite sure that there is quite a number of countries which will support Russian position, because we already have at least part of this position agreed upon. So it's not only about Russia, China, and the US, but Russia, China, and the US, and possibly other like countries like UK and India definitely will need to, if not address, but simply acknowledge the concerns of each other to move forward.
Okay, thank you. A question from Fyodor Roslikov. Fyodor, if you are here, will you pronounce your question, or I can do it?
Yes, I'm here. I can specify my question because
I like your avatar. I like your avatar. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Thank you. Because in my humble opinion, our level of scientific development cannot don't allow us to execute like massive warfare in space. So currently, maybe the only warfare that we can execute in space is destroying each other's satellites. And as I think it's not too hard, for example, to replace them, to send some new, and even the destruction of the large fleets of satellites cannot subsequently damage the security of any super country. So don't you think that the problem of an arms race in space is a bit exaggerated and used as like maybe a propaganda cliche with the aim of presenting some countries as irresponsible and using this factor for political pressure. In particular, for example, the United States has repeatedly accused China of the arms race in space and called for more international sanctions against the People's Republic of China. So, simply my question is a problem of arms race in space is exaggerated?
Well, I don't think it is exaggerated because if there were no discussion on prevention of arms race in space, then possibly we will be in another era with actual like strike systems already there and so on. But as there was a public interest in preventing it, we still have fairly limited capabilities for warfighting in space, as you put it absolutely correctly. And now, of course, it is used as propaganda to a greater level, but at the same time, like destroying of one's satellites, of course, it will not be the same as like destroying one's land forces or navy or whatever, but it will effectively degrade the warfighting capability on the ground, of course, because it will be limited. And major countries, including the US, are very actively looking for solutions to not so such destruction of space fleet, to put it this way, will not be such a huge damage. One way to address it, and it is being developed, is so-called rapid launch services. So basically, to have lots of space launch vehicles or ready to deploy replacement satellites at short notice. Of course, it is important if we speak about like some major warfighting for this satellite replenishment capability to be based not on like huge spaceports, but on some fairly limited zones of land or even be road mobile, as we actually see with the Chinese case, because they've repurposed their ICBM/space launch vehicle to become like a full-scale space launch vehicle that is being launched from road mobile launcher or even from a barge, which is definitely, on the one hand, it shows that it will be quite hard to effectively, like, fully undermine the space capability of that country, but then it shows that such a threat is considered a very serious one, and actual investments are being put to like overcome this threat. But also another way to look at it is just to develop systems that will not depend on space. For example, like have unmanned aerial vehicle-based communication networks or even navigation networks. Some inertial navigation systems that can be used not only by like can be put on not only like some major things like ICBM launchers or ballistic missiles or submarines, but also can be used like in the infantry squads. So these efforts are there, which means that, of course, sometimes military industry simply gets high on its own supply, to put it this way. So basically they use this propaganda for their own purposes to develop things that are basically not needed, but I don't think it is the case. On that, also what is very important, and this is basically, I think, a sort of American innovation, is that they're looking into developing a so-called reserve space fleet. They have like reserve air fleet, which means that their commercial airlines they sign a contract with the military, and they are obliged to provide airlift capability in case of war. And now they are looking into having some similar arrangement with commercial space operators, both launch providers and spacecraft satellites operators. And what is interesting, it includes a provision that, like, during a conflict, for example, the satellite imaging providers will not only be obliged to provide imagery to the US military at short notice, but also will be prohibited of providing this imagery to anyone else, which is quite interesting because basically one of the major sources of revenue for these commercial satellite operators or satellite imagery providers is that they offer the imagery to everyone who pays. And would be very interesting to look how it works like in the coming, I think, years or even months. I hope I've answered your question, and thanks for it. It's a really good one.
Thank you. We have a question from Oksana Beck about the international law and the jurisdiction of space objects, if I understand correctly your question. Are you here? Can you pronounce your question?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead.
So, thank you very much for the presentation. I have to confess, though, that I kind of phrased my question badly. So, using the opportunity to ask it orally, I will rephrase it a little bit. There have been some norms drafted that acknowledge the role and the interests of private entities in space, for example, the Cape Town Convention and the Space Protocol to it. But don't you think that with the states sort of imposing their will on space gradually, the space would be sort of nationalized in future, and in cases resulting with damage to space objects, the state would bear sort of undivided responsibility and not the private entity?
Yeah, that's a very important question, and I don't think that the space can be nationalized. Even Moon cannot be nationalized, hopefully. Although there is it's a side question, but now there is a very serious debates about how the efforts within the so-called Artemis program by the US, how they comply with the non-militarization of Moon agreement according to the Moon Treaty. But it is a whole another story which we can spend another few hours discussing. But coming back to your question, currently there is a mix on that. And actually I've been a few weeks ago, I've been invited to an event hosted by the private international law company called Valterra Fieta, I think. And they have actually quite a portfolio of being part in the legal cases of damages for spacecraft, where parties are both states and non-state actors. So I think it is very much the situation is dynamical. So things change. We do not have much actual legal, how to say it, legacy legal information on how this or that practically works. So it's we'll see, to put it simply. I don't think that there is a definite answer to a question, because probably no one is ready to say that it will be this or that way. What is very important, and I think I've mentioned it, is that we have so many commercial actors in space now, and actually I'm expecting that rather sooner than later again we'll see actual private actors filing suits against the nations who destroyed something in space, or space debris that originate from their satellites, damage this or that spacecraft by commercial operator. It will be very fun to watch how it will work out, because it's a very interesting and dynamic domain here. Thanks.
Thank you. We have two questions from, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce it correctly, Falguni Sundaram Biswal. So the first question is about, are we alone in space? I'm not sure that's a question related to military aspects of space policy. And the second question is about, well, the values and who benefits from space research. If I understand your question correctly, if you're here, can you pronounce your question?
Thank you, Chair. My first question is, NASA science programs address fundamental research about the universe and our place in it. How did the universe begin and evolve? How did our solar system originate? How and why is the Earth changing on all timescales? This fundamental research covers all areas of science and interaction. Therefore, when addressing the question, are we alone? And this question already discussed in NASA budget 2021, also in 2022 also. And my second question is, will the material resource of outer space, a million plot, what is on Earth equal to totalization power and their resource nationalist tendencies, or will they occur to US and like-minded nations where a balance of power that favors freedom prevails? Will the industries and job and partnership of the 21st century, including leadership on climate change and green technology, occur to the ambition of those benefiting from petrocracy, or will they be in the hand of free people? As you know, in India, one organization is there, ISRO. As you know, in every time if flood come, if drought come, ISRO working to evacuate people from satellite image. So like that, my question is like that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for your question. Well, I think that we're definitely not alone in space. It's simply infeasible, but I'm not sure that we will ever have credible evidence, at least on our lifetime, that is the case. On the second question, well, it's complicated because I don't think that space here differs much from other areas. Like we have a lot of like the one who have resources to, well, extract other resources will basically have all this stuff. It's not there is like no charities in this domain, which is definitely not might be not very sustainable in the long run, but it is the reality. So I'm not sure that I can like answer your question in a way that will make everyone happy. But I think again, space is not separate from what's going on Earth, and almost every problem that we have here on our surface have something similar going on in space, or that will be going on in space in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Question from Diana Alagirova. If you're here, can you pronounce your question?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much. As I have already written, thank you for a really good, well-structured lecture. Well, it was really a pleasure for me. And my question concerns the United States in space. Why don't they try to lead the space regulation system? Because they have all of these loopholes and opportunities to militarize the space, to put weapons on their satellites, for example. Why are they not trying to lead in the space law, in the space regulation system, and to prevent militarization, for example, from other countries, or just global militarization of outer space?
Yeah, well, I think, again, I believe that there will be more detailed presentations on Americans, but I think one of the reasons for that is the Americans and American industry and, well, American government as well are very, well, opposed to any external pressure, external limits on their own development. We've seen it in many cases. We see it now. But what's interesting actually is one of the reasons for that is, for example, with ASAT capabilities, while now the Americans actually said that they will look into ASAT ban, there is a classic link between ASAT and the anti-ballistic missile defense. And it depends on what is more fashionable this or that time. Like, for example, when we still have the ABM treaty, many efforts developed by the Americans were labeled anti-satellite. Now we don't have ABM treaty, then everything is missile defense, but it can be used as an anti-satellite. So the bottom line is they probably they can lead some of the efforts to ensure that the loopholes remain, but most importantly, they are very eager not to impose any more limits. Another example from, well, probably unrelated area, but which is very important, we have this thing called Missile Technology Control Regime, and the MTCR has controls like a lot of stuff, but also it especially controls the full weapons, the ballistic missiles, and the unmanned aerial vehicles, which initially meant cruise missiles, but then there was a more or less joint understanding that it covers to some extent like big strike unmanned aerial vehicles, as we know them. The Americans, until recently, they had like their own understanding, which included this stuff and effectively prohibited exports of these large unmanned strike unmanned vehicles. But then they decided simply to like rewrite the way they understand the provisions and to make it open for their exports. So I give this example simply because the Americans are very eager to avoid any limits on the military industry and the military exports. So and as we do not have a joint understanding on what actually is a space weapon, and I think this is one of the biggest challenges for the things to come, they are quite cautious not to have like a blanket ban on some stuff that they will need very much in the future. I hope I've answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Fantastic how many questions we have. This is really great. So we have a question from Ehtiram Mamedov about the United Nations and the cosmic water. I believe this is also about the jurisdiction and international law. Ehtiram, can you pronounce your question?
Hey, yes. Hello, hello everyone. Thank you very much about this very interesting presentation. My question is there any law, resolution, or some norms about using universal energy, cosmic energy, energy of the stars, energy of pulsars, and so on, etc.? And the second question is, United Nations have main constitution about using not just cosmic water, especially elements from different parts of galaxy or that will be found in different planets or in cosmic space or something like this. Is there some regulation norms, or it just free for everyone, for every country, or for every organization? Thank you very much.
Yeah, great question. I'm afraid I would not have like an explicit answer because, well, there might be something that I'm not aware of. But my understanding is that currently there are no norms, no legal basis for that. But this legal basis is being developed again within this Artemis Accords process led by the US, because the idea is just to have some sort of commercial activity on moon surface. And basically, we are currently witnessing the development of such norms for the use and exploitation of space resources. I think, well, as back in the day, we've seen with the development of like norms of international humanitarian law or norms for Antarctic or for the law of the sea. Now we're seeing something that is similar going on in space, basically while we are talking. So now the short answer is no, there are no norms, but yes, those are being developed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have another question from Yuan Zhuji. Are you
Yes,
here?
thank you.
Yes.
May I see that by myself? Yes, thank you. My question is, in last year, the United States discovered a large number of missile silos that China is almost complete in the northwest region. But it's interesting that the first group of people who found it is not the United States military, but a group of ordinary people who use commercial satellite resource discovery due to the improvement of the commercial satellite technology in recent years. It also has a very high military value. Will commercial satellite technology become an important means for more and more countries, especially developing countries, to conduct military reconnaissance? Thank you.
Yeah, great question. And again, short answer is yes, the commercial satellite capabilities are becoming more and more important, including for military. Another example is actually these strikes by Iran against the air base in Iraq, where the American forces were deployed. At least the way it was shown in the media, that they've used commercial satellite imagery for targeting of their missiles and for other precise targeting. In case of the satellite silos in China, it's actually very complicated case. On the one hand, personally, I've never seen the original satellite images with good definition that actually proves the points made by our American colleagues, which are great people. Like, I know many of them personally, and I do not think that they're just trying to cheat us. But well, it's not that simple, like that they've got basically we're looking through commercial images and found something. So it really looks sometimes this open source intelligence stuff looks like laundering of the like actual hard intelligence. And well, of course, American officials said that they're happy that their job is being done by someone else. My personal understanding is that it's not that simple. So basically, there might have been involved. But at the same time, I'm very much concerned that officials are no longer interested in basically showing the evidence for this or that claims. And they always say like, yeah, everything is clear. We have these reports by these like private entities, and it is enough like to impose sanctions or to call out these people for these or that violations. From my perspective, it's entirely abnormal. It's good that we have like these commercial images that can be used by the by the general public. Because in the end, it increases the involvement, it increases the understanding of what's going on by the people there. It increases awareness of like people like you and me of what's going on. But at the same time, if we go to the government level, then the government should provide the credible sources of their own intelligence, not just refer to some people in this or that institute or on the internet, who basically like, yeah, well, why should we explain you anything? Everything is written by that folks there. So this is like there are positive things about this increasing capabilities of commercial assets, but there are also quite negative stuff because the governments are becoming, to put it this way, some governments are becoming more accountable because stuff they're doing can be observed by many people and by the public, while other governments are becoming less accountable because they do not bother to provide their evidence to substantiate their claims. Yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. We have a raised hand from Daniil Kuznetsov. Daniil Igorevich, are you here? You didn't print out your question.
Yes,
so...
I'm here.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Excuse me?
Please, go ahead. Do you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much for your precise report. I have a question. Yes, I have a question. Or what are the limits of using GLONASS and GPS systems nowadays? And are there any prospects for using them in the future? Thank you.
Well, GPS is basically like the oldest global positioning system, and probably some limits that it has come from the fact that, well, they use some legacy technology, but I think the upgrades are incoming, and yeah, there will be hardly any limits. For GLONASS, it's more complicated. For example, of course, we have more limited numbers of satellites. The satellites are, well, less reliable, less long-living because of, including because of sanctions by the Western countries against Russian industry. So it is getting more and more complicated to obtain some microelectronics and so on for the development. Although I'm pretty sure that these challenges will eventually be addressed and overcome, but it means that for some time there will be no like development toward next generation of satellites, because now, as far as I know and I'm aware of, the biggest problem with GLONASS is that the satellites do not work long enough in orbit, and they have to be replaced more frequently than GPS. But at the same time, another problem is, of course, that we lack the global ground infrastructure to ensure the operations of this satellite constellation. It is not. It is definitely not like a deal breaker. So it's still operational, GPS and GLONASS, and especially as for civilian purposes, almost everywhere now we have 2 or 3 or even 4 global navigation systems integrated, like including with Baidu and Galileo. But for military purpose, if we speak about some probably some overseas operations that can be undertaken in the future by Russian military, which will be like further than in Syria, for example, then it might become a challenge, although there are definitely no details about how big challenge it is in the open domain. Because like if we speak about some low intensity conflicts that is not far away from Russian territory, then GPS works perfectly for the military purposes. Again, there is also another question, how hard it is to like spoof GLONASS and GPS signals comparatively. But again, this is not something that I'm aware of actual data available. So it is something to consider, that probably there might be some differences in the hardening of GLONASS, GPS, Baidu against the interference. But it's just like theoretically there are some differences, but we do not have actual data on that.
Thank you.
Okay, before we let you go, I also have questions. If anyone has something to say, please raise your hand. But I would like to ask a very, very general question, and you have covered a lot already in your presentation and answering some other people's questions. But if we look in the future, and if we talk about the new Cold War or new military political competition, which Russia is obviously would be a part of, and the United States and European Union and China and some other centers of power, how dangerous is the space domain regarding the actual military conflict? For the last month, we hear a lot of reports about Russia being about to attack Ukraine, but nobody is talking about Russia attacking Ukraine or any other country with space weapons. Everybody who is part of that hysteria is still talks about conventional, old school conflict, which has nothing to do with space, or almost nothing to do with space. So if space is a serious problem in the future military political competition, what should be afraid of? What is dangerous? There is a space treaty which prohibits the weapons in space, and as you have said there is a very different interpretation what is a weapon in space, and hardly this definition would be agreed upon by all the parties anytime soon. But still, what should be afraid of and what should be a part of a new treaty which someday somehow might be discussed among the Russian Americans, Europeans, and Chinese? Thank you.
Well, that's a really good question. I just minor correction, like the Outer Space Treaty prohibits not all weapons, but weapons of mass destruction and nuclear weapons in space. So that's the caveat. But what should be afraid of? Well, of course, space is like a any conflict in space is continuation of a conflict on Earth's surface. And actually it relates to other domains as well. For example, like I can hardly imagine a cyber conflict that does not, if we speak about like actual warfighting, that does not involve old school hardware actually like rolling into adversary cities. But if we speak about space, what should we be afraid of? The biggest challenge is that we have so many such a level of entanglement of conventional and nuclear assets related to space. So any attack against space assets that is considered to be a part of like deterrence or a part of undermining the conventional capability, for example, if someone starts to spoof GPS or GLONASS to prevent the Russian or American forces in actually from being involved in some regional conflict, the side that is on the receiving end of such spoofing might believe that it is a part of a more general attack, and then basically increase readiness of its strategic forces. And if then some spoofing is done against nuclear command and control communications space related space assets, then it can be considered an attack against like nuclear forces and lead to like early nuclear use. I don't think that it is something that can happen like right now, even given the crisis we have. It should be a much higher level of conflict with increased readiness of basically everything. But this is something that is worth remembering, and how it should be addressed. The one way to do it is, again, becoming more transparent, become about your concerns and acknowledge the concerns of your adversary. Because otherwise we have a very bad understanding of what is the message this or that actor wants to convey by this or that action. So yeah, the simple answer is just to engage with your partners, with your adversaries, with everyone, to increase your awareness of their concerns and understand that. I often make this point with relation to nuclear weapons and other sophisticated weapons. Like, no one invests in these huge capabilities for the sake of having these capabilities. It is always a result of threat perception. So as long as when you understand the threats you're afraid of, and your partner is afraid of, and your adversary is afraid of, you can look to address not the symptoms, but the disease itself, the threat that is considered. Because again, history shows us that more often than not, those threats exist in the minds of the decision makers, not in reality. But in the end, sometimes these threats become a self-fulfilling prophecies. And we've seen it too often, and we've seen huge conflicts ravaging our planet. So it might be a good idea to prevent conflict in another conflict that will ravage not only our planet, but also the near Earth orbits around it. And that, I think I'll stop. I hope it was interesting for you.
Dmitry, thank you very much. I think we will stop right there. We would like, all of us would like to thank you for your brilliant presentation, for your overview, for your time. I know that you're a very busy person. You will have a lot of stuff to do later today. Thank you very much. If we would be in a offline auditorium, we would clap our hands, but so far we're just hang in there. All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll see everybody in 20 minutes in 12:45. And we will continue discussing the space policy of the United States. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It was a pleasure and an honor. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
We would be glad to see you in our later events. Thank you.